The courthouse was alive with whispers long before the trial officially began. The echo of footsteps on polished marble floors, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional cough from the gallery created an uneasy rhythm that reminded everyone present of the gravity of the moment. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, casting golden streaks across rows of wooden benches. Yet despite the warm glow, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Everyone knew that today's hearing was different. At the center of it all was a child. A little girl no older than 7, small and fragile. Her presence had drawn a crowd larger than any ordinary trial might command. Reporters waited outside, and curious citizens filled the public gallery. They weren't there to see the lawyers or even the accused. They were there for her, because she was the key witness, the only one who had seen the events unfold. When the bailiff opened the side door and she entered, the entire room seemed to pause. Her shoes made soft taps on the tiled floor, and her hand clutched a worn, gray stuffed rabbit whose ears had long since lost their shape. Her eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, wide with fear, until they landed on the large German shepherd seated calmly near the witness stand. The police dog, specially trained to assist vulnerable witnesses, sat tall and quiet, its dark eyes fixed on her with unwavering focus. She hesitated, shrinking closer to the woman guiding her forward, but the moment her gaze returned to the dog, her shoulders eased, if only slightly. The dog seemed to radiate an invisible reassurance, as if silently promising that no harm would come to her here. The judge, an older man with a stern expression softened by age, leaned forward. His gavel rested unused at his side, but his eyes followed every movement of the child. He had presided over countless cases, murder trials, fraud, theft, disputes between bitter families, but rarely had he seen a witness so young, so vulnerable, and yet so crucial. Without her, the case might crumble. With her, the truth could finally surface. The jury shifted in their seats, clearly affected by her entrance. Some of them exchanged nervous glances. How could such a small child possibly carry the weight of such a serious matter? The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rose to her feet, her papers clutched loosely in her hand. She gave the girl a reassuring nod, a silent gesture meant to ease the burden. Across the room, the defense attorney leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a faint smirk. He whispered something to his client, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who sat stiffly at the defense table. The man's eyes remained fixed on the child, cold and unflinching, while the girl instinctively turned her head away. The defense attorney clearly believed that silence would be his greatest ally. If the girl froze, if she failed to testify, doubt would win the day. The bailiff stepped forward and gestured toward the witness stand. The little girl moved slowly, each step heavy with hesitation. When she finally climbed into the tall chair, it seemed to swallow her. Her small legs dangled above the floor, unable to touch the ground. The dog padded over quietly and settled at her feet, its tail brushing against the side of the chair. She glanced down, her fingers brushing its fur, and for the first time since entering the room, she allowed herself a shallow breath of relief. The gallery fell into complete silence. Even the sound of the ceiling fan above seemed distant now. All eyes were on her, the child who might change the course of the entire trial. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at her carefully. He saw the fear in her trembling hands, the weight of memories she was far too young to carry. He also saw a spark in her eyes, hidden beneath the fear. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" the prosecutor asked softly, careful not to push. The girl glanced at the stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't answer, but her eyes flickered toward the police dog at her feet. The dog remained motionless, calm, as though it knew this moment belonged entirely to her. The prosecutor exchanged a brief look with the judge, who gave the smallest nod. Everyone understood the delicacy of this testimony. The jury leaned forward unconsciously, unable to look away. Some members of the gallery clasped their hands tightly, waiting. The defense attorney tapped his pen against the desk, impatience etched across his face. To him, this was nothing more than a game of endurance. If the girl stayed silent, he would seize upon it as proof of unreliability. If she spoke, he would attempt to tear her words apart. But in that moment, the trial wasn't about legal strategies or technicalities. It was about a child's ability to find her voice in a room full of adults who expected too much from someone so young. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. The silence wasn't ordinary. It carried weight, pressing down on every person in the room. Even those who had come only to witness a spectacle felt its gravity. Something significant was about to happen, something that would leave a mark not only on the case but on everyone present. The little girl looked up at the judge, her lips parting slightly as though she might speak, but then she lowered her gaze again. Her hands trembled harder now and her grip on the rabbit tightened. The judge's stern features softened for just an instant. He wanted to speak, to reassure her, but he knew he could not. Justice required patience. The police dog lifted its head slightly, nudging her shoe with its nose. She blinked, startled, then bent forward just enough to touch its ear. The touch seemed to ground her, anchoring her to something safe amid the storm of adult eyes surrounding her. The room collectively held its breath, and in that suspended moment before a single word had been spoken, the atmosphere of the courtroom told the entire story. A fragile child, a loyal dog, a room filled with tension, and the weight of truth waiting to break free. That was how the trial began, not with arguments, not with evidence, but with the quiet bravery of a little girl and the unspoken comfort of a police dog by her side. The courtroom remained hushed as the prosecutor adjusted her notes and looked at the little girl seated nervously in the witness stand. The child's small fingers twisted the floppy ears of her stuffed rabbit, the seams stretched from years of clinging. Her eyes darted between the floor and the police dog resting patiently by her feet. The animal's calm presence seemed to steady her, but not enough to free her voice just yet. The prosecutor began carefully, her tone warm and gentle, as though she were speaking to her own daughter. "Do you remember why you're here today?" she asked softly. The girl's lips parted, then closed again. Her shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath, but no sound emerged. The silence spread like a shadow over the room. The jury shifted uneasily, the wooden benches creaking in protest. Some of the jurors tried to offer faint smiles, hoping their kindness might reach her. Others stared at their notepads, afraid their gaze would only deepen her fear. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, lips twitching into a smirk. He tapped his pen rhythmically against the table, a signal to his client that things were already turning in their favor. The accused sat rigid, his eyes fixed coldly on the child. The weight of his stare was heavy, and though she never dared to meet it, she seemed to sense it pressing against her. The prosecutor tried again. "It's okay, sweetheart, you don't have to rush. Can you tell us your name?" The girl hugged the stuffed rabbit, burying her face against its worn fur. The court reporter, waiting to capture her first words, glanced up uncertainly. The judge shifted in his seat, his usually firm expression softened by concern. He tapped his gavel lightly, not to interrupt but to remind the room to remain still. The trial, the press, the whispers, all of it could wait. What mattered now was this child. Seconds dragged on, stretching longer than anyone expected. The sound of a clock ticking faintly on the wall punctuated the silence, each tick like a hammer in the ears of those waiting. The jury's unease deepened. They knew the case hinged on her testimony. Without her words, there was only speculation, fragments of evidence that could easily be twisted. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, silently asking for permission to continue. He gave her a brief nod. She turned back to the child and lowered her voice even more. "Do you remember the nice dog sitting with you?" she asked, pointing gently toward the German shepherd. The girl's eyes flickered downward. She touched the dog's ear briefly, and for the first time her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. The animal didn't move, didn't break its stillness, but its presence seemed to whisper reassurance. The prosecutor followed carefully, sensing a path forward. "He's here just for you. He's your friend today. Can you tell him your name?" The girl lowered her head, her lips moving slightly as though forming words only the dog could hear. but her voice was so faint that no one else caught it. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, trying to catch the sound, but it disappeared into the air before it reached them. The defense attorney pounced on the moment, rising to his feet. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "with all due respect, if the witness cannot or will not speak clearly for the court, then her testimony is unreliable. We cannot rely on whispers and silence." The judge raised his hand, silencing him. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Sit down, counselor. She will be given the time she needs. This is not a race." The defense attorney scowled and reluctantly sat back down. His client shifted in his seat, visibly irritated. Meanwhile, the girl's silence grew heavier, as if it were a living presence in the room. She bit her lip, her eyes shimmering with unspoken words. The prosecutor leaned in slightly, her own expression calm, refusing to pressure the child. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "do you see me? You don't have to look at anyone else, just me. Can you say one word for me? Anything you like, even your bunny's name." The girl blinked rapidly, her lashes wet with forming tears. She squeezed the rabbit. The prosecutor's voice softened further, carrying more comfort than command. "It's okay if you can't right now. We're proud of you just for being here." A murmur ran through the gallery. Even seasoned reporters, hardened by years of trials, felt the tension twist in their stomachs. It was clear this little girl was fighting a battle no child should ever have to face. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied her carefully. He wasn't only a judge in that moment. He was a grandfather who saw his own in her trembling form. The law required impartiality, but humanity demanded compassion. He spoke for the first time directly to her, his voice deep yet softened. "Young lady, you are safe here. No one can hurt you in this room. Not while I sit here, not while this officer is beside you." He gestured slightly toward the dog. "You don't need to be afraid." The girl's eyes flickered toward him briefly, then down again. She stroked the dog's fur with shaky fingers. Still, no words came. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Each person in the courtroom seemed to feel the weight of her fear pressing into their own chest. Yet beneath that silence, there was something else too, an unspoken resilience. She hadn't run. She hadn't broken down. She was still there, holding her ground in the only way she knew how, by not giving in. The prosecutor finally stepped back, sensing that pressing further in this moment might shatter the fragile courage holding the child in place. She looked at the judge with an unspoken plea: patience. The judge gave a solemn nod. His gavel remained still, but his presence commanded the room to respect the moment. The jurors, though restless, understood that this silence was not failure. It was the beginning of a struggle between fear and courage, a struggle everyone knew could define the case. As the bailiff adjusted his stance near the door and the court reporter exhaled quietly, the little girl clung to her stuffed rabbit and leaned just slightly against the police dog's shoulder. She didn't speak, but her body told the story. She was terrified, yes, but she was also trying. And though not a single word had been heard clearly, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. Every adult in the room realized that this wasn't just about testimony or evidence. It was about watching a child confront her deepest fear. The silence that filled the room wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of courage in the making. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, almost suffocating, when the German shepherd shifted slightly at the little girl's feet. It was a small movement, barely more than the adjustment of a paw on the polished wood floor. But in that moment, it felt monumental. The sound of claws clicking softly against the ground echoed louder than it should have, breaking the unbearable stillness that had settled over the room. The child's eyes flickered downward, away from the crowd of strangers and the intimidating face of the man seated at the defense table. She reached out cautiously, her small fingers brushing the dog's coarse fur. The shepherd didn't flinch, didn't startle. It merely tilted its head, acknowledging her touch without demanding more. Its calm eyes stared straight ahead, patient and steady, as though it understood its purpose perfectly. The jurors noticed the change immediately. Some exchanged subtle glances, recognizing how the girl seemed to anchor herself through the dog. A few even smiled faintly, their doubts softening. This wasn't a staged trick, no performance, it was instinct, the bond between fear and comfort, fragility and strength. The judge leaned forward in his high-backed chair, resting his chin briefly on his hand. He'd presided over hundreds of cases, but he couldn't recall one where an animal had commanded so much silent authority. It was as though the dog's presence carried its own testimony, unspoken but undeniable. The prosecutor, recognizing the subtle shift, decided not to press the girl with questions yet. Instead, she allowed the silence to linger, trusting the dog's steady presence to do what no words could. She placed her notes down gently, folding her hands together in a gesture of patience. Meanwhile, the defense attorney leaned toward his client, whispering something with a smirk. He clearly thought this reliance on a dog was a weakness, a desperate attempt to coax words from a child too frightened to speak. He had no idea that sometimes the smallest sources of strength were the most powerful. The girl stroked the dog's ear with tentative movements, as though testing whether the comfort would remain if she leaned on it. The shepherd stayed still, its breathing slow and steady. The rhythm of its chest rising and falling became an anchor, a quiet reassurance that reminded her she was not alone in this cavernous room. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, her shoulders dropped slightly. It wasn't much, just the faintest release of tension, but it was enough for everyone watching to notice. The judge's eyes softened. The prosecutor allowed herself a breath of relief. Even the jury seemed to lean closer, willing her to hold onto that courage. The bailiff, standing rigid by the door, shifted his stance ever so slightly, though his eyes remained on the room. He too seemed moved by the sight of the child's trust in the dog. This was not a spectacle but a raw, unfiltered glimpse of humanity, something that reminded them all why justice mattered. The child pressed closer to the shepherd, her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in one hand. Her lips moved as though she were whispering, though no words reached the rest of the room. Still, it was a step forward, a tiny act of bravery that hinted she might soon break through the wall of fear that had held her silent. The prosecutor finally spoke, her voice gentle, almost as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile connection forming between the girl and the dog. "You're safe here," she said softly, her tone carrying across the room like a warm blanket. "He's here for you just like we are." She gestured toward the shepherd, who remained unmoving, a pillar of silent strength. The girl nodded faintly, barely a dip of her chin, but it was the first acknowledgement she had given all day. A ripple of emotion spread across the room. Jurors glanced at each other, recognizing how extraordinary it was that a child who had been so paralyzed by fear was beginning to find her voice, not through the coaxing of adults, but through the quiet companionship of a dog. The defense attorney rose suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Your Honor," he began with exaggerated annoyance, "this is ridiculous. We are wasting the court's time allowing an animal to act as mediator. If the witness cannot testify to this court, her words, spoken to a dog no less, should be inadmissible." The girl flinched at the sudden noise, shrinking back into her chair. The dog reacted instantly, not aggressively but protectively. It shifted its weight, pressing gently against the child's legs, anchoring her once more. The judge's gavel struck sharply, silencing the defense attorney before he could continue. "Sit down," the judge said firmly, his voice carrying no room for debate. His eyes, however, softened again when they returned to the child. "The court will not dismiss the courage it takes to speak, no matter how it happens." The defense attorney scowled, but he obeyed, sinking back into his chair with a huff. The child's breathing steadied again as her hand returned to the dog's fur. This time, she leaned forward slightly, as if drawing strength directly from the shepherd's quiet resolve. Her lips moved again, but this time her voice was just audible, a tiny murmur that carried across the microphone at the witness stand. She wasn't speaking to the prosecutor. She wasn't speaking to the judge or the jury. She was speaking to the dog. The words were too soft to be fully understood, but the act itself was undeniable. She was beginning to share. The gallery, packed with spectators and reporters, held its collective breath. No one dared to move. The stillness in the room wasn't born of tension anymore, but of reverence. It was as though they all realized they were witnessing something fragile, something sacred. The judge, the lawyers, the jury, even the bailiff, every adult in the room, recognized the shift. The girl was not alone. She had found her channel of courage in the animal by her side. The police dog, unmoving yet deeply present, had become more than a comfort. It was a bridge, and across that bridge, the truth was beginning to make its way into the open. That moment, simple, quiet, easily overlooked, was the turning point of the trial. Not in the legal arguments, not in the stacks of evidence, but in the small hand of a child resting on the ear of a dog who seemed to understand everything without needing a single word. And though the silence had not yet been broken completely, the courtroom no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt charged with possibility, as though the truth was standing at the threshold, waiting for the courage of a child to let it step through. The prosecutor took a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the notes on her desk, though she no longer needed them. The evidence, the photographs, the timelines, all of it paled in comparison to the little girl sitting in the witness stand. Everyone knew that her words would be stronger than any file or exhibit the prosecution could present. But those words had to come from her, and so far, the child had clung only to silence and the quiet comfort of the police dog at her feet. The German Shepherd remained steady, unflinching. Its dark, intelligent eyes focused straight ahead, yet its body leaned ever so slightly against the girl's legs, grounding her in the storm of adult eyes and expectations surrounding her. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her tiny knuckles white against the faded fabric. The prosecutor approached again, this time moving more slowly than before, her heels making soft clicks against the polished floor. She stopped just short of the witness stand and lowered her voice, warm and calm. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you don't have to be afraid. No one here will hurt you. Not while I'm here. Not while he's here." She gestured toward the shepherd, who sat unblinking, a statue of patience and loyalty. The girl's lips trembled. For a moment, it seemed she might try to speak, but then she bowed her head and whispered something barely audible into the dog's ear. The sound was so faint that it was swallowed by the vastness of the room before it could reach the jury. A ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor froze, uncertain if she had imagined the sound. The jurors leaned forward, straining to catch what had been said. The defense attorney smirked, seizing the moment. "Your Honor," he declared, rising with an exaggerated flourish, "this is absurd. The witness is whispering to an animal. Are we seriously to pretend this constitutes admissible testimony?" His voice dripped with mockery, as though the very idea was laughable. The girl flinched at the sharpness of his tone, retreating into the oversized chair. The dog pressed closer against her legs, its silent presence reminding her she wasn't alone. The judge's gavel struck sharply, silencing the attorney before his words could do more damage. "Sit down, counselor," the judge ordered firmly. His eyes, however, softened as they turned back to the girl. "This court will show patience. We will not rush or intimidate a child into silence." The defense attorney scowled but obeyed, sinking back into his chair. His client sat stiffly beside him, expression dark, though a flicker of unease crossed his face at the sight of the girl's growing courage. The prosecutor knelt slightly, lowering herself closer to the girl's height without stepping onto the witness platform. She spoke again, not to the courtroom but directly to the child. "It's okay to tell him," she said softly, nodding toward the shepherd. "You can tell him what you saw. We're all listening, but you can tell him first." The girl's hand moved slowly, fingers stroking the dog's fur in rhythm with her shallow breaths. She bent forward, her lips almost brushing the shepherd's ear. This time, her whisper carried farther, soft but clear enough to reach the microphone. "I saw everything," she said. The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling yet powerful enough to shatter the suffocating silence that had gripped the room for so long. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The court reporter's fingers froze above her stenotype machine before resuming with frantic taps. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, some leaning forward, others holding their breath. The prosecutor's heart leapt, though she kept her expression steady for the girl's sake. The judge's expression remained firm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, respect, perhaps even awe. He had doubted whether the child would ever speak, but here it was, the first thread of truth pulled from the depths of her fear. The defense attorney half rose again, his mouth open to object, but the judge silenced him with a glance sharp enough to cut. No one in that room was going to interrupt this moment. The little girl's voice wavered, but she continued, still speaking to the dog. "I saw him," she whispered, pointing with a hand that clutched her rabbit. The gesture was small, hesitant, but deliberate. Her eyes never left the shepherd's calm face, but her finger pointed clearly toward the man seated at the defense table. The accused shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He tried to hold his composure, but a faint twitch in his eye betrayed his unease. The jury absorbed the gesture with silent intensity. Some scribbled hurried notes, others simply stared, their earlier doubts dissolving beneath the weight of the girl's fragile testimony. The prosecutor didn't push her, didn't flood her with questions. Instead, she allowed the child to linger in her own words, to take strength from the dog's steady presence. The girl's trembling subsided slightly, her breaths evening out as though each word she spoke was loosening the chains of fear that had bound her. In the gallery, whispers stirred again, hushed but urgent. Reporters leaned closer, their pens flying across notepads. What had seemed impossible minutes before was now unfolding before their eyes. A child too terrified to speak was finding her voice, not through the coaxing of adults, but through the quiet companionship of a dog. The judge leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression unreadable to most, though those who knew him well could see the storm of thought behind his eyes. He had presided over trials filled with deceit, manipulation, and hardened criminals. But this was something different. This was the raw, unvarnished truth, pulled from a place too pure to be fabricated. The girl whispered again, her words trembling but louder now. "He hurt people," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of memory. She buried her face briefly against the shepherd's fur, as though hiding from the images her own words conjured. The dog did not move, did not flinch. It bore her pain silently, offering nothing but stillness, as though it understood that its role was not to comfort with action but simply to exist as her anchor. The prosecutor's throat tightened, but she kept her composure. "You're doing so well," she said softly. "Thank you for being so brave." The defense attorney clenched his jaw, fury simmering beneath his forced composure. He had counted on silence, on fear. He had not anticipated courage blooming in whispers. The jury, meanwhile, leaned even closer, their expressions etched with empathy and belief. They weren't just hearing words, they were witnessing bravery itself. The girl lifted her head, her cheeks damp with tears she hadn't even realized had fallen. Her voice shook, but she spoke again, still directed at the dog. "I remember everything." The courtroom froze. The judge's gavel remained untouched, the prosecutor's papers forgotten, the defense's smirk erased. It was the first whisper, fragile but unstoppable. And from that whisper the truth had begun to break free. The silence in the courtroom stretched thin, like a taut string ready to snap. The little girl's last words, "I remember everything," still lingered in the air, reverberating inside the hearts of everyone present. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, their pens still, as if writing would shatter the fragile moment. The police dog remained steady, a silent sentinel of patience and courage. Its chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, grounding the child with every breath. The girl's fingers tangled deeper into its fur, her small body pressed against its warmth. For the first time, she did not look entirely afraid. The prosecutor kept her distance, careful not to intrude on the fragile connection between the girl and the animal. She knew that forcing words now might push the child back into silence. Instead, she gave her space, her voice soft but audible enough for the jurors to hear. "Take your time," she whispered. "You don't have to rush." The defense attorney, however, could not stand the quiet. He rose from his chair abruptly, the squeak of the wooden floorboards echoing louder than intended. "Your Honor," he began, his tone dripping with irritation, "are we truly going to let this charade continue? We cannot build a case on whispers to a dog." "Sit down, counselor," the judge snapped, his gavel striking once. The sharp crack silenced the attorney and redirected all eyes back to the child. The judge's gaze softened as it rested on her. "Young lady, you may speak however you feel comfortable. The court will listen." The girl hesitated, hugging her stuffed rabbit closer. Her lips moved, but her voice emerged as a faint murmur, words directed not to the adults towering around her, but to the shepherd sitting patiently by her side. "They told me not to tell," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the dog's calm face. The animal didn't move, didn't blink, but something about its stillness seemed to encourage her. "Who told you not to tell?" the prosecutor asked gently, careful not to raise her tone. The girl lowered her gaze. "The man," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the microphone. "He said if I talked, bad things would happen." The words fell into the room like a heavy stone, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. A few jurors exchanged startled glances. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across their notepads. The accused shifted in his seat, his jaw clenching. For a brief moment, his mask of composure slipped, revealing the flicker of anger he had tried so hard to hide. The defense attorney placed a hand on his client's arm, urging him to remain still. The little girl continued, still speaking only to the dog. "I wanted to hide. I wanted to disappear. But you came," she said softly, stroking the shepherd's ear with trembling fingers. "You sat with me when nobody else could. You stayed." The jurors leaned forward, captivated by the rawness of her words. She was not merely giving testimony. She was revealing a bond, one that allowed her to confront fears too heavy for her young shoulders. The prosecutor took a cautious step forward, lowering her voice to match the girl. "Can you tell him what you saw? Just him. Pretend it's only you and him in the room." The girl inhaled shakily. Her small hand clutched the dog's fur as though drawing courage from the simple act of touch. Slowly, haltingly, she began. "I saw him take her away," she whispered, her eyes flickering toward the accused before darting back to the shepherd. "She was crying. She wanted to go home." Her voice trembled, cracking at the edges, but she did not stop. He wouldn't let her go. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The prosecutor's chest tightened, her instincts urging her to press for more details, but she resisted. The girl was speaking, and that was enough for now. The judge leaned forward, his expression grave. The weight of the child's words carried more than accusation. They carried truth born from innocence. The defense attorney stood again, unable to restrain himself. "Objection," he barked. "This is hearsay, emotional manipulation at its finest. This is not testimony, it's storytelling." "Overruled," the judge replied instantly, his tone cutting. He turned his gaze on the attorney, eyes cold. "I will not allow you to belittle this child or her courage." The girl flinched at the attorney's harshness, burying her face briefly against the shepherd's fur. The dog remained still, unmoving, its presence unwavering. After a moment, the child lifted her head again, her eyes glistening with tears but also with determination. She whispered once more, louder this time, her words trembling but clear. "I saw him hurt her. I saw him push her. I saw her fall." The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors froze, absorbing every syllable. The accused's face twisted, his composure cracking further. The prosecutor's throat tightened, but she spoke calmly. "You're doing so well," she told the girl, careful to keep her tone steady. "You're very brave." The child wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, still leaning into the dog. "I didn't want to remember," she whispered, almost to herself. "But he remembers for me. He knows I'm safe." The judge blinked, his expression momentarily softened by the words. It was not just testimony unfolding. It was something deeper, something almost sacred. A dialogue between innocence and loyalty, between a fragile child and a creature whose silence spoke louder than any human voice could. The prosecutor let the silence linger, then asked gently, "Do you want to tell him anything else?" The girl looked at the shepherd, her small hand patting its head. She took a deep breath. "He was the last one there," she whispered, "and I wasn't supposed to tell, but now I did." The dog blinked once, a subtle movement that seemed, in that instant, to carry weight far beyond instinct. The girl's shoulders loosened, the tightness in her posture fading slightly. The courtroom remained hushed, the air heavy with the power of her words. The judge finally exhaled and leaned back, his gavel resting but unused. He knew the case had shifted in that moment, not because of evidence or strategy, but because of something no one could have anticipated. A conversation that bypassed fear and found truth in its form. And as the little girl leaned closer to the shepherd and whispered one last time, "Thank you for listening," even the hardest hearts in that room could not deny the impact of what they had just witnessed. The unexpected conversation had begun to unravel a case that once seemed impossible to win. The last whisper left the girl's lips, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The weight of her words clung to the air, thick and undeniable. For a moment, even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to quiet, as though the building itself was listening. Then it happened, an audible collective gasp. It rose from the gallery first, spilling like a wave through the benches of onlookers. Some covered their mouths, others widened their eyes in shock. The jurors, bound to stillness by their role, could not hide the flickers of astonishment crossing their faces. Even the bailiff, stoic and expressionless by training, shifted uneasily. The judge brought his gavel down hard, its sharp crack echoing off the wooden walls. "Order! This court will have order," he demanded, but even his voice could not erase the tremor that had just passed through the room. The accused shifted in his seat, his eyes darting from the jury to the little girl, then back again. His face, once composed and smug, had begun to show cracks, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a tightening of his hands into fists against the table. For the first time, the mask of control he wore was slipping. The defense attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. His hand gripped his client's arm as though to keep him anchored, but the tension in the man's body spoke of anger he could barely contain. The prosecutor, on the other hand, remained utterly still. She had seen juries gasp before, but rarely like this, rarely with such force, as though the truth itself had reached out and gripped them by the throat. She glanced at the girl, careful not to crowd her, and noted the way the child's shoulders had straightened ever so slightly. The whispers to the dog had begun to transform her fear into strength. The girl, for her part, seemed unaware of the shock she had unleashed. Her world was small, narrowed down to the faithful shepherd at her feet. She stroked his fur slowly, her lips pressed together in determination. She had said it. She had told the truth. And though she trembled, there was a new steadiness in her breathing. The judge cleared his throat, reclaiming the room. "Ladies and of the jury," he said sternly, "you will disregard your audible reactions. This testimony will be weighed carefully and without prejudice. Am I understood?" The jurors nodded in unison, though the flicker of awe in their eyes had not dimmed. The defense attorney rose, adjusting his tie in a show of forced confidence. "Your Honor, I must renew my objection. We cannot allow this spectacle to dictate the course of justice. A child whispering to a dog is not evidence. This is nothing more than theatrics designed to sway emotions." "Sit down," the judge commanded, his voice cold. "The court recognizes the bravery of this witness. You will not diminish it." The attorney's lips tightened, but he obeyed, lowering himself back into his seat with a glare that carried venom. The prosecutor took a cautious step forward, her voice steady. "Sweetheart," she said gently to the girl, "you've done something very brave today. Do you feel ready to tell him?" She nodded at the dog. "Anything else?" The girl hesitated, her fingers twisted around her stuffed rabbit, her gaze fixed on the shepherd's patient eyes. Then, in a voice trembling but clear, she whispered again, "He said nobody would believe me. He said he would come back." The gasp that followed was sharper this time, more cutting. Some jurors leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. Reporters scribbled with renewed frenzy. The accused's face darkened, a flash of fury breaking through his veneer. The judge's gavel struck again. "Enough," he barked. "There will be order in this court." His words were meant for the gallery, but his gaze drifted toward the defendant, holding him in a stare that seemed to cut through the pretense of innocence. The girl, trembling, clutched the shepherd's neck. Her voice quivered but did not falter. "But I told you," she whispered, as if reassuring the dog. "So now he can't scare me anymore." The room fell into silence once again. The weight of her courage pressed down heavier than the accusations themselves. The prosecutor allowed the moment to linger before nodding respectfully to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe the witness has said enough for today." The judge studied the child for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Agreed." His tone was softer now, touched with something human beneath the robes of authority. "The witness is excused." The bailiff moved forward carefully, ready to escort the girl out, but the shepherd stood first, moving with quiet dignity. The child rose with him, one hand clutching her stuffed rabbit, the other resting against the dog's back. Together they walked past the jury, their steps small but resolute. Every eye followed them. The jurors, the lawyers, the judge, even the spectators, all watched as the child and the animal left the stand. Not one of them doubted the truth of what they had just witnessed. As the heavy doors swung closed behind them, the silence they left behind felt monumental. The judge finally leaned forward, his gavel resting against the bench. "This trial," he said gravely, "has taken a turn no one could have predicted, but let it be clear, courage, no matter its form, will not be dismissed in this courtroom." The prosecutor exhaled slowly, a quiet wave of relief washing over her. She knew the battle was far from won. The defense would fight tooth and nail, twisting facts, seeding doubt. But the tide had shifted. The jury had felt something they could not feel. The defense attorney sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. His client's fury simmered beside him, boiling just beneath the surface. He knew the whispers had landed. The gasps had sealed it. The case was slipping, and there was nothing theatrical about that. For now, the courtroom settled into an uneasy calm. But beneath it, every heart knew the trial would never be the same again. The child's courage had torn through the silence, and the courtroom, gasping as one, had borne witness to truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with unease after the girl's testimony. The echo of her whispers still seemed to linger in the wooden rafters, a haunting truth that no gavel strike could erase. The jury had heard it, they had felt it, and the defense attorney knew it. He straightened in his chair, tugging at his tie, his eyes darting toward the jurors. He could see the flickers of sympathy etched on their faces. Dangerous. Sympathy in the wrong place could override reason. He had to act quickly, decisively, to tear down what the girl had built with her fragile courage. When the judge called for a recess, the attorney leaned close to his client. "Don't react," he hissed. "If you look angry, it only makes her more believable. Let me handle this." The accused ground his teeth but nodded, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. When the session resumed, the defense attorney rose with deliberate calm, smoothing his jacket. He walked to the center of the courtroom, his polished shoes echoing against the floor. His voice, when it came, was smooth and confident, calculated to reclaim the stage. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, gesturing broadly, "what we witnessed earlier was touching. A child's story whispered into the ear of a dog. Heartwarming, yes. Emotional, certainly. But is it evidence?" He let the question hang in the air, his eyes sweeping across the jury box. "We are in a court of law, not a fairy tale, not a bedtime story. The prosecution would have you believe that a frightened child's whispers amount to truth. But you and I both know children can be mistaken. Children can be influenced. Children can imagine things that never happened." The jurors shifted. Some frowned at his words, others scribbled notes as though weighing his argument carefully. The prosecutor clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to object. She knew better than to interrupt. Let him weave his performance, she thought. The jury had seen the girl. They had felt her truth. His words could not erase that. But the defense attorney pressed on, sensing his opportunity. "Consider this. The child never looked you in the eye. Not once. Every word she spoke, she directed to an animal that cannot testify, cannot be cross-examined, cannot confirm or deny what was said. Convenient, isn't it?" He allowed himself a thin smile. "Objection," the prosecutor finally said, rising. "Counsel is deliberately belittling a vulnerable witness." "Sustained," the judge replied sharply. He turned his gaze on the defense attorney, eyes cold. "Tread carefully, counselor. You will not ridicule a child in this courtroom." The defense attorney bowed his head slightly, masking his irritation. "Of course, Your Honor. I merely mean to remind the jury that we must separate fact from feeling. Sympathy cannot convict a man. Only evidence can." He returned to his seat with measured calm, but his words had done their work. A seed of doubt, however small, had been planted. When it was his turn to cross-examine the witness's prior statements, he approached with a gentler tone than usual. He had learned long ago that juries despised bullying children. His strategy was subtler now, a knife hidden behind a smile. "Miss," he said, crouching slightly so that his eyes were level with the girl as she sat on a bench during redirect, the shepherd beside her, "you're very brave to be here. I just want to ask you a few simple questions, all right?" The girl hugged her stuffed rabbit but gave a tiny nod. Her eyes remained fixed on the shepherd, her anchor in the storm. "You said you saw someone," the attorney continued, his voice smooth as silk. "But you were very scared that night, weren't you?" The girl hesitated, then whispered to the dog, "Yes." "Of course you were," he said quickly, nodding as if in sympathy. "Scary things can make it hard to remember details. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, don't they? Especially when we're young." The girl's lips trembled, but she did not answer. She only pressed closer to the dog. "Objection," the prosecutor interjected. "Counsel is leading and suggestive." "Overruled," the judge said, though his tone was clipped. "Proceed, but carefully." The defense attorney smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor. Now, sweetheart, you didn't actually look directly at the person's face that night, did you?" The girl's silence stretched. She leaned down, pressing her cheek against the shepherd's fur, and whispered something too soft for the microphone to catch. The dog blinked once, unmoving. The attorney seized the hesitation. He turned to the jury, his hands spread wide. "You see, even she is unsure. Even she cannot say with confidence what she saw." The prosecutor rose instantly. "Objection. Counsel is testifying for the witness." "Sustained," the judge barked. "Strike that from the record." But the words had already been heard. The defense attorney smirked inwardly, satisfied. Seeds of doubt watered and fed. He pressed once more, his voice soft and coaxing. "Isn't it possible, sweetheart, that you were frightened, and maybe you thought you saw something that wasn't really there?" This time the girl lifted her head. Her eyes, though wet with tears, narrowed slightly. She turned to the shepherd, stroking his ear, and whispered loud enough for all to hear. "No, I know what I saw." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the courtroom. The jurors stiffened. The prosecutor's chest swelled with relief. Even the judge leaned back, watching the child with a newfound gravity. The defense attorney faltered for half a beat before regaining his composure. He forced a smile. "Of course you believe that," he said smoothly, "but believing and knowing are two different things." The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Enough, counselor, return to your seat." The attorney obeyed, but fury simmered beneath his calm mask. He had tried to unravel the girl's testimony, to strip it of power, but instead she had reaffirmed it with quiet, unshakable conviction. As the girl was gently escorted out of the courtroom, still clutching her stuffed rabbit and walking beside the shepherd, every juror's eyes followed her. Whatever doubts the defense had tried to seed had not erased the image of her courage. The defense attorney sat heavily, his hands clasped tightly. He had played his hand, but the jury's faces told him the truth. The child's words, whispered into a dog's ear, carried more weight than all his polished arguments combined. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, a quiet fire burning in her chest. She knew the defense would not stop here. They would strike again, harder in their closing arguments. But for now, the girl's voice had held firm. And in a trial where silence had once seemed unbreakable, that was victory enough. The final day of the trial arrived with a tension so heavy that even the creak of the courtroom's wooden benches felt louder than usual. The gallery was packed, reporters jostled for space, pens poised, while the jurors filed in with solemn faces. Everyone knew that today would decide the fate of the accused, and the whispers of a little girl still echoed in their memories. The child was not present for this last session. She had already done her part, her fragile voice carrying truths that had shattered the silence. Instead, she remained safely elsewhere, cared for and guarded, while her courage stood in her place. The shepherd, too, was absent, resting after days of silent duty, though his presence lingered in the minds of all who had seen him. The defense attorney rose first for closing arguments. His expression was sharp, his voice smooth as he began packing before the jury box. "Ladies and," he said, spreading his hands, "this is not a question of sympathy. This is not a question of who we feel for. This is a question of law, of evidence, of facts. And the facts in this case are flimsy. There is no physical proof tying my client to the crime. None. All the prosecution offers you are the words of a frightened child, words not spoken directly to you but whispered to a dog." He paused, letting the words sink in. His eyes scanned the jurors, hunting for any glimmer of doubt. Children are easily influenced, easily frightened. You cannot, in good conscience, convict a man based on imagination and whispers. To do so would be to abandon reason, to abandon justice. He returned to his table, confident that he had delivered his final blow. Then the prosecutor rose. She did not pace. She did not gesture wildly. She simply stood with calm dignity, her voice steady as she addressed the jury. "You have seen many things in this courtroom," she began, "but I want you to remember one moment above all. The moment a child, too terrified to even look at this man, found her courage. Not for us, not for the jury, not for me, but for a dog who could not judge her, who could not twist her words. She spoke because, for the first time, she felt safe enough to tell the truth." The jurors leaned forward, their faces intent. "She did not ask for sympathy," the prosecutor continued. "She did not weep for attention. She whispered what she had carried in silence, and in those whispers there was no hesitation, no fabrication, only truth. You felt it, you heard it, and you know deep down that children do not invent such horrors, they survive them." Her voice sharpened. The defense would have you dismiss her because she spoke to a dog, but perhaps that is the point. Because when adults failed her, when fear silenced her, it was an animal's loyalty that opened the door to truth. Should we punish her for that? Or should we honor her courage by listening to what she risked so much to say? The prosecutor stepped back, her eyes sweeping across the jurors. "You are not asked to convict on sympathy. You are asked to convict on truth, and the truth has already been spoken. The choice is now yours." The courtroom fell into silence as she sat down. The judge turned to the jury, his expression grave. "Members of the jury, you will now retire to deliberate." The jurors filed out, their faces solemn, carrying the weight of justice in their hands. The courtroom buzzed with hushed voices during their absence, reporters scribbling furiously, onlookers whispering theories. The accused sat rigid, his eyes dark, his jaw tight. Hours passed, tension thickened, then at last the jury returned. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, stood as the judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied. The clerk received the slip of paper, unfolded it, and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The words struck the room like thunder. Gasps erupted, then hushed instantly as the judge's gavel demanded silence. The accused's face contorted, fury breaking through his mask as he slammed his fist against the table. The bailiffs moved in instantly, restraining him as the gallery erupted with emotion, some sighing in relief, others whispering prayers of thanks. The prosecutor closed her eyes for a brief moment, a wave of relief washing over her. She thought of the little girl, safe elsewhere, and the shepherd whose stillness had given her voice. Justice, at last, had listened. The defense attorney sank into his chair, defeated, his polished words powerless against the truth that had risen in whispers. The judge waited until silence returned. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full weight of the law but also the warmth of humanity. "This trial has been unlike any I have presided over," he said gravely. "Justice is often sought in facts, in evidence, in testimony. But justice also listens to courage, to innocence, to the voices that struggle hardest to be heard. Today, we witnessed a child confront her fear not with loud accusations, but with fragile whispers, and those whispers carried the weight of truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. Let it be remembered that justice is not blind to the quiet. Sometimes, the smallest voice holds the greatest power. His gavel struck one final time. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted, reporters rushing to file their stories, onlookers buzzing with the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Outside the courthouse, the little girl sat on a bench in the sunlight, her stuffed rabbit in her lap and the shepherd at her side. She did not know the legal terms, the verdict, or the weight of what had been decided inside. She only knew that the man who had frightened her could not hurt her anymore. She leaned close to the shepherd, her voice a soft whisper meant only for him. "We did it," she said. "He can't come back now." The dog blinked, his quiet strength unchanged, his loyalty unshaken. He pressed closer to her, a silent guardian who needed no words. And for the first time in a very long time, the little girl allowed herself to smile. Her whispers had been enough. Justice had listened.